It's a great pleasure for me to be here today, to be able to talk about the changes that are occurring in the world of futures thinking. Now, the future has a very special characteristic. For one thing, the future is generally viewed as important. Why? Because the future is where you're going to realize your dreams, or perhaps encounter your fears. So the future is the world of our hopes and our fears. But where does the future come from? Very hard to say. Look at the world today. So many things happen that we could not have predicted. So many things happen that we don't even know really how to give it a name. The world we live in is a world of novelty, of difference, of change. The common expression is the only constant is change. The only certainty is uncertainty. So, given how important the future is for our hopes and our fears, for what we pay attention to, what we think is important today, where does the future come from? The future actually comes from many different sources. And these sources are in our history, in our past. They're from the stories that we heard when we were children, told to us by our grandfather or our grandmother. They're the stories that come from Hollywood. Very often, the futures in our mind come from other parts of the world. So how are we to understand better these imaginary futures? These futures that are the result of trying to be inventive or creative about tomorrow. Well, it really has to do with what we're talking about here at ICESCO, which is future studies. How do you study the future? Studying the future is precisely this effort to begin to understand the stories we tell. Oftentimes we tell stories, for instance, about a hero, or we tell the story of a disaster, or we just tell the story that's meant to be a cautionary tale. Again, working through the sources of these futures is an important part of understanding the world around us. Futures are full of hopes and fears. They're full of predictions and desirable futures. Being able to disentangle, being able to understand the difference between a probable and a desirable future is actually very important for feeling more comfortable with the future. Now, because the future is so powerful, it's actually very agreeable to feel comfortable with the future. The monsters that sometimes scare us. There's a situation where, for instance, you think the world is flat, and the monster is falling off the edge of the world. But then you realize, somebody explains to you, no, the world is not flat. You can't fall off. The world is round. And you see the world differently. This is what it's like to understand better how our imagination influences what we see and what we do. Think about the difference here, a very simple difference, between something that's probable and something that's desirable. And I'll give you a very everyday example. When you cross the street, it's because you want to get to the other side. That's a desirable future. The desirable future is to be on the other side of the street. But in order to get to the other side of the street, you have to calculate the trajectory, the paths of the cars, so you won't get hit by a car. So you estimate the future, you calculate the future on the basis of the past, probability, data, the car that you see, how fast it's going, and then you decide, now's the time for me to cross. But the desire to cross, what you imagined is on the other side, that's something that's a fantasy. That's something that's a dream still. I want to be on the other side because I'm going to join my friends. I'm going to go for dinner. I'm going to go to the office. You have an idea of the future that's a fantasy or something that you are inventing as desirable. desirable to be on the other side of the street. What I'm showing you right now is that there are two ways of thinking about the future. There are two kinds of futures. One is the probable future, and the other one's the desirable future. And the way we think about them, the way we imagine them, is different. Now, understanding all of that is really something that's very basic to all humans. And I just want to make a little point here that even a single-celled creature, so that's a little bacteria that you can't even see, we do experiments and you put it in a dish. And on one side of the dish, there's sugar, and on the other side of the dish, there's no sugar. What does that single-celled creature do? The little bacteria that you can't even see with your eye. It goes to the sugar. Why? It goes to the sugar because it has developed over time that capacity to say, if I go to the sugar, it will be better for living. In other words, all organisms, all living organisms, have what you call anticipatory systems. They are able to anticipate. And today, the shift that's taking place in future studies is not about inventing some idea of going to Mars, or some idea of flying cars, or some idea that's very old-fashioned of space cowboys, the way cowboys were in the past. That's not really what the future is about. Now we understand that the future is much more importantly and fully about where do your ideas of the future come from? How can you create your own ideas of the future that reflect your own history, your own culture, your own context? And on the basis of that, it's much easier for people to say, I desire, I hope, I see aspects of the world, elements of the world around them that are their own. So this is a change from the childhood way of thinking of the future, which is when you're a child, you're small, you look at big brother, you look at big sister, you look at mother, you look at father, and you say, I want to be just like them. It's normal, catching up, converging to something you already know. But as everybody is aware, as you get older, you realize that you're not big brother, you're not big sister. You're yourself. You are your own person. And you have your own idea of the future, your own idea of your hopes and your fears. And futures literacy, which is a capability, a capacity, it's not a tool or a technique, it's a capacity to use the future, is an open capacity. In other words, when you learn to read and write, we don't know what you're going to use that for. Will you use it for good? Will you use it for bad? Will you, with reading and writing, will you write poetry? Will you write recipes? What will you write? What will you read? We don't know, but you're capable. You have a capacity. The same thing applies to thinking about the future. When you become futures literate, you're able to use your imagination for many different reasons, with many different methods, in many different contexts. And by becoming futures literate, we can become less afraid of the future, less afraid of change. In fact, the exact opposite. Because when you are open about the future, when you have confidence in your imagination, you can see change and difference as resources, as sources of inspiration, as sources of learning. And through learning, we become wiser. Through learning, we enjoy being alive. And the learning that's possible when you become futures literate is rich and fulfilling. That's what future studies is about now. Thank you.